So for those of you signing on, we're just working through some of the last minute logistics. Everything is working smoothly. We're just waiting for some more folks. We'll probably try to start at around 10:05 or so. Rob, did you want to put your video up there? Because after I introduce you, I will pop out on video, but you may want to put your video up there right now if you're going to start off.
Yeah, so I'm dialed in. I'm not going to have video. So
you're not. Okay, that's fine.
So.
That's fine. That's okay.
Yeah.
Are you on the road somewhere?
Yeah, I'm just in a bad location for video. It's
okay.
A lot of background stuff.
That's okay. Hope everyone is doing well this lovely Thursday. Rob, we're the new global headquarters of Cardiff. I imagine you guys are all working remotely?
We're a bit distributed. So I'm in actually NorCal right now and pending a move to SoCal with COVID delaying that. And then we've got some folks in San Diego. One of our founders is in Bend, Oregon. Okay. And then a couple others in Sacramento, Oakland, kind of mostly distributed West Coast.
Good. Of course, Tech San Diego is all working from home in the temporary global headquarters in Rancho Penasquitos.
Nice. I grew up in Poway, so.
Oh, good.
Right.
Sarah, are you going to stay on in case we need you for anything?
Yes, I'm here, and okay. Jimmy has logged in as an attendee, not as a panelist. So I just need him to log out and use the panelist invite link.
Have you resent it? Can you resend it this morning, maybe?
Yeah, I sent it a few minutes ago, but.
Okay. So James, if you're on the attendee side, please log out and use the link that Sarah had just sent you a couple of minutes ago to log back in. Rob grabbed another guest presenter, so we're waiting for him to log in.
Let me try and add him over here.
We're using the GoToWebinar platform. This has worked pretty well for Tech San Diego since the pandemic. All of our meetings have gone virtual. I attended a CEO Roundtable meeting this morning. Virtually. Lots of interesting discussions about when to bring people back and how and scheduling and hierarchy and everything else. I had wrote in my last newsletter that everyone was really happy about working from home in the beginning, and I think everyone was just happy everything didn't collapse, and productivity kept on going. And I think since then a lot of issues have really emerged, and this is just one of a series of webinars which we're going to be putting on, but all kinds of issues have kind of popped up. Culture and retention and burnout and ergonomics and a whole host of things. Communication, workflow. Hasn't been all peaches and cream. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with this. Greetings, my name is Kevin Carroll. I'm Executive Director of Tech San Diego. This meeting was actually just designed to be a guest speaker for our CTO, Chief Software Development Roundtable. I know we have Angelina Hendricks, the chair of that, is on the line, and she may want to make a pitch at some point for those of you who are directing software development or manage software developers to attend that monthly meeting. We got a little bit off schedule, but with August and with this, we're going to get back on track on that. If you don't know who Tech San Diego is, please go to techsd.org. And again, this is just one in a series of kind of COVID-19 related workforce webinars that we've been putting on. We've been putting on anywhere from probably 2 to 3 a month. And this is one. The cloud is a really big issue, as you can imagine, for us. So I started scouting around for someone to come in and talk to us about these cloud issues. And this is designed to be a small group. So please remember that the questions, go to the question, type your questions in there. If it's deemed, and I don't know how I got to be the arbiter of this, but if it's deemed that we may want to stop and actually ask the question, I will. But normally we just wait towards the end. So Rob, keep that in mind, you and your guests, that we're probably going to wait for the questions. The attendees that are listening, they have no way to talk. So the way they talk is through the question. So that should be pretty visible on those of you joining. If not, I think you should all be at least a little technical. So I'm going to assume that you can get to the question pane. And I will go ahead and I'm going to turn it over to Rob. Rob Ruth is the CTO of CardiffPoint, an engineering DevOps firm really focused on business transformation in the cloud, which is why we're here. Previously, he served as a strategic advisor at Western Digital for the data center systems and client solutions business units. Prior to that, he held several executive roles at high growth startups, including ones a couple of us here in San Diego know very well, including our friends at Skinnit and Lindos. So a nice background. They've been, since this pandemic, they've been busy as ever, kind of helping companies work through what this cloud-enabled workforce looks like. So with that, Rob, I'm going to turn off my video so no one has to look at me and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kevin. Morning, everyone. So like Kevin said, my name is Rob Ruth. I'm the CTO at CardiffPoint. We had actually scheduled this call for maybe a little over a month ago. So, one good thing of doing this a bit later is that we have, a lot more data coming back from the market and, metrics we've seen and customers we've engaged with over the last several months. So I'll need more data to back this presentation. And like Kevin said, given the small group, is that there's some canned content here, and any questions people have, feel free at the end, as we'll keep some time open for Q&A. And so little past 28 days later, we're more 4 months later. But like I said, that's just given us more insight into how this is going to adapt workforces going forward, and especially impacting technology teams. We've seen that HR has been heavy hit, but I'd even say that technology teams have been hit harder. So rough agenda, go through some intros, and then some impact on the pandemic of COVID-19 on workforce and cloud adoption. And then I've got three real high-level topics that I was going to run through that we've seen that are predominantly hitting companies on the tech side, which are shadow IT, some of the zero trust networking and remote access concerns people have had, and then a very large one, which has been compliance. We've seen this across a number of clients, is that compliance has been a hindrance in adopting and accelerating some of the remote needs of employees. And then taking a look at some next steps. And then we do have on the call Jimmy Ruiz from Google, who's going to give some insight into really a company at scale. I mean, everyone knows Google, and how for quite some time now is that they've adopted a lot of these policies around zero trust networking and remote work, and a company of their scale of how they've done that. And like I said, leave some time open at the end for some Q&A. So a little intro and background on CardiffPoint and myself. So CardiffPoint, we've been around just coming up on a year. And the real focus here is being a technology service company and accelerating companies' time to market in the cloud. The background of all of us in the company, we all have 20+ years in data center and cloud. Actually, all of us started our careers in data center, and so lived through the transformation of moving workloads from physical on-premise, wiring closets, server closets, and into data centers, and ultimately into cloud workloads. We're a Google partner, So our primary focus is really an emphasis on Google Cloud itself, and we've seen that over the last few years. Really accelerating to the market and have an offering that's really trumped a lot of other competitors. Given looking at the types of workloads across AI, ML, microservices, a lot of the initiatives people have when they're either uplifting their current workloads from other cloud providers or actually taking their first move from on-prem to the cloud has really fit Google. So it's been a great partner. Most of our customers today are either cloud native or we've taken them through the cloud native journey, moving from on-premise to the cloud. So a little background on myself. So like Kevin said, I started my career in San Diego through a number of pretty high growth startups. Praja was a data analytics company, a little ahead of its time. We did a lot of work for broadcast.com actually prior to Mark Cuban selling it to Yahoo. And then actually we're the data backend for actually all the sports services for Yahoo for a number of years. So basically any sports analytics you saw on Yahoo's site was generated from Praja. And then spent some time at, actually I was employee number 2 at Lindos or Linspire. Again, we're a little early to market. We were a desktop Linux company. I think our biggest claim to fame is we sold a $200 PC back in 2000 in Walmart. And then actually a number of us transitioned. We left Lindos and were some of the first employees at Skinnet, which is really a huge success. We scaled up from very early stage through a $100 million plus company that's selling the platform to companies like T-Mobile, Microsoft. We were actually one of the #1 sellers in the Microsoft stores at launch. And then back in 2012, I moved up to the Bay Area to run operations for a cloud storage company, which again, rapid growth. We scaled out to 100 million plus users. And Western Digital was actually where I did our D round. So when I left Lindos, actually shifted over to Western Digital and was a strategic advisor for them on their data center business unit for about 1.5 years. And then I shifted over to the consumer side where they ship about 300 million devices a year and had very little cloud strategy for the consumer side. And so helped with an acquisition called Up There and then folding Up There into cloud strategy for the consumer side. So COVID-19 impact on workforce. We've all seen this. We've lived this personally and professionally for the last 4 months. It's changing, and people like to talk about new norms, and I think the reality is on the technology side is that these aren't just new norms; these are going to be permanent norms. The way in which we work and the way in which we deploy technology to end users and to the workforce is changing, and it will change for the foreseeable future. Like I said, given that we're a few months into this, we're getting some pretty interesting stats coming back. Gartner did a report a couple months ago. 90% of organizations have now shifted their workforces partially or fully to work from home. 30% of people have stated that they'll begin allowing remote workforce permanently. I would actually say this number is higher. The Gartner reports are usually conservative. Of the companies we're working with, I would say that this is probably 75% plus. Have adopted a remote work policy, and probably 50% of those employees that are currently working from home will not return to work. The companies are just finding that employees are being more productive, and a lot of the fears around productivity drops and communication issues, collaboration issues, these just aren't a concern once they've moved past the initial shift to remote work. This is an interesting one, though. I might tend to disagree with from Gartner as well, is that 50% of HR leaders indicate that poor technology is an impact on end users. I think this depends on the segment. Is that we're seeing, especially on the cloud native side, of companies that have previously adopted or started as cloud native companies. The shift to a remote workforce for them was minimal. They already were using tools like G Suite and GitHub and other cloud-based tools for building, deploying software or facilitating a remote workforce, whether those employees were working on-prem or not. And so the shift for them was just really a change in licensing or just scaling up and scaling out. So I think where the bigger impact on these companies is where they're still living on premise, and they have IT teams that are running physical infrastructure that now had procurement issues, and there was delays in hardware, and those are the biggest ones we're seeing, is that teams that can't buy servers, they can't buy equipment, they can't buy network switches, and so facilitating and growing a remote workforce has been an issue for them. Then this last one is that almost 75% of companies are looking to shift to a permanent remote work schedule. Is that I think this is just the reality. I think that this idea that the remote workforce that's in place today, that's kind of adapted over the last few months, is going to change. Is that the remote workforce is going to stay permanent. I think what percentage that is up in the air, but the companies we're working with, like I said, it's a large number are going to shift to a permanent work from home forever. Another one, looking from a company standpoint of company size and how they're shifting. Like I said, is the companies that had greater than 50% working remote to begin with, is this just wasn't a big change for them. And you look down the road at the companies that had over 50% workforce, over a third of those employees are never going to return to work. So the big question now becomes is how do we adapt to that workforce if you weren't currently cloud native or didn't currently have tools in place to accommodate these employees that are never going to come back to an office. I could spend a whole hour probably on this slide alone. I have for the better part of my career, I have leaned on remote workforces, and so whether that's been offshore work or just hiring domestically remote employees, is that some of my highest performing engineers have been remote workers. And so every company I've been at, I've advocated where they've had strict physical on-prem requirements for employees, is that I've pushed strongly to adapt that and start looking at remote workers. And so, sorry, so the window pop up. But like I said, so remote workers are 40% more productive than people who work in a corporate office. Whether it's 40% or not, I think it depends on the department. I think it depends on the business. But in my experience, strictly from an engineering side, is like I said, that some of the highest performing engineers I've had have worked remotely outside of an office. Another interesting one we've seen is that typical remote employees are working 3 weeks more a year than an on-premise employee. And this is just the nature of not being chatty. Like, they don't have the walk-ups to their cubicles, and they're not getting pulled into meetings, and typically working longer. We've seen this with our customers, is that over the last 3 or 4 months, as we talk with engineering teams, is that the one response they have is that, one, they're more productive, and two, they're actually putting in more hours per day than they were when they worked on premise. And this isn't busy work. This isn't reactive work to COVID. This is, they're actually burning down story points and pushing more features out, and that's pretty unanimous across the board. So I think this is a pretty true statement, is that when we talk about new normals, I think new normals, we should assume that a third of the workforce is not coming back to the office. Whether this is for health reasons, whether this is for companies adapting and saying that they're not going to bring a portion of the workforce back. I think as technology leaders, we have to assume that we need to accommodate now, a pretty large portion of employees that will be working remotely. So phasing that in, so COVID-19 impact on the cloud adoption. This is when we've seen is that there's been a big push towards cloud for the last 5-10 years. And many companies that were falling behind and lagging on those cloud initiatives were now forced into a position where they had to adapt and they had to go pursue more cloud-based options to scale. And especially those companies that were pushing or running a lot of on-premise applications that now couldn't scale. They couldn't facilitate a remote workforce in time, so they had to turn to cloud solutions to enable that workforce, even if those cloud solutions were temporary. It's an interesting quote, and I think that this can't be denied, is that if this pandemic had happened 10 or 12 years ago, I think we would have been in a very different position from a technology standpoint. Syracuse made a statement that without scalable cloud services, that the current disaster would have been incredibly worse. And I can't think that can't be more true. Is that we're in a position now where every company had to go out and procure hardware to scale their remote employees and get more laptops, more services, more VPNs. We would have been in a much different position than we were. We've asked this question a lot of employees or of customers is, what position could you be in where you can now scale your remote workforce, where you go from 10% remote to 50% remote over a weekend? A lot of companies can't do that when they're not leaning on cloud. This is one we've seen as well. So, given CardiffPoint's background and some of the founders with our ties now to still legacy data centers, the Equinixes, the CoreSites, they themselves are scaling at incredible demands as well. They're all exceeding. They've basically done their year projections in the first 2 quarters of 2020, and this is all being driven by cloud services. People putting more physical equipment into physical data centers to drive SaaS-based services. So this is an interesting one. TSR is a company that puts out cloud marketing reports. This was actually a report that was put out for projections on cloud services prior to COVID. And so we look at the growth of public versus private cloud leading into 2020. And not surprisingly, they still saw that there's going to be some pretty impressive growth in both public and private cloud. They saw a slowdown through early 2020 and then accelerating into 2021. Growing to a little over $140 million or $140 billion. The interesting one here is we're now through Q1, and so we have some Q1 marketing data on where this actually landed, and it exceeded by over $100 billion. So there's been massive growth within all of the cloud markets. So not just public and private cloud, but SaaS-based services, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service. Every company is turning to these to grow their infrastructure to support these remote workloads. And on the flip side of it as well is, we're seeing kind of 2 sides of the fence, is that kind of the common themes are enabling the remote workforce, but then also the increased demand on SaaS services is when we have customers that, they've by far exceeded their projections, already this year. And so it's been a very reactive growth for some of these SaaS services to bring on new users at the scale that they're growing.
Rob, what do you mean by private and public cloud? I'm sorry.
So looking at public services, so things like Amazon, GCP, Azure, versus private cloud services, so things like VMware.
Okay.
People building private clouds on site on physical servers. So the biggest market growth they're seeing, through Q1 that have been reported is clearly SaaS services. So we talk about things like infrastructure as a service, platform as a service. So services like GCP, Amazon. It's actually more of the providers. So people like Zoom, people like Dropbox, Box.com. It's the SaaS providers that are actually seeing the largest growth. And even so, the platform as a service, infrastructure as a service are still growing exponentially. There's a large increase in digital payment that we're seeing across customers, and this is as people are shutting down brick and mortar, or where they've been hybrid or both brick and mortar and online. They're shifting more of their services over to online services. And then, like I said, the SaaS segment will hold those largest sides of the cloud. They're forecasting for through 2021. And this is all being driven by COVID. So, like I said, this is remote workforce enablement. This is, scaling and usage of services. There's dozens of services that are growing exponentially that are pushing back on the cloud. So, there's a lot of metrics you can look at. So this one is just an example was, business applications that are being downloaded, and we're 90% year over year for 2019. And so there's no question that, companies and now remote workforces are turning to cloud-based services to enable their workloads. Google Meet is an interesting one. I have one slide here. This was one that actually, so Google did a phenomenal write-up about a week ago on how they scaled Google Meet to accommodate the 30x increase in usage. This is actually, this report was put out based on statistics through, I think, early April. They've grown actually quite a bit larger since then as well. But it was a phenomenal write-up on, looking at how you can scale a service the size of Google Meet that's servicing, as at the time the report was written was their paid G Suite users. Since then, they've actually opened up a free tier to Google Meet. So this has grown quite a bit more actually since the write-up. But, they basically in under a month, they scaled 30x what their usage was prior to COVID. And they're doing 3 billion minutes a month of video, and onboarding. I think now it's closer to 4 million users every day. So Zoom's kind of been the highlight of everybody. Everybody's turned to Zoom, but given that there's a large number of companies that currently have G Suite, they're turning to things like Meet that are included with that. And it's sometimes overlooked, but these services are scaling phenomenal. Microsoft Teams is another one. So people running Office 365 that are now turning to Teams in lieu of Zoom. It's another one where they've scaled their services from doing 5 or 10 million users a day to 75 million through April. This is an interesting tweet. So and looking beyond that is so things where people are interacting with different services. So this is a tweet that Aaron Levy, who's the CEO of Box.com, put out regarding the usage of Box and Zoom integration. And they've basically 30x'd their current usage on integrations. So, looking across a couple of different services, so, again, we've been through Q1, so we can see where this is impacting the market and how it's impacting services. So, Google Cloud is 43% up year over year for 2019. Dropbox is up 18%. Mongo's up 45. HashiCorp was an incredible one where people that don't know HashiCorp, they're a cloud tool set they build things like Terraform and Packer for doing agnostic tooling for different cloud providers. I think it was 2 weeks into COVID, they did a $175 million round on a $5 billion valuation in the middle of COVID. So, Amazon's up 25%. Peloton is one that I brought up just because it's an interesting use case where, it's a company that entered, they have both, the physical bikes and a cloud-enabled platform where, their growth is up 66% for the year. It's a cloud-native company, and COVID, they had no impact on them. I use Peloton 5 or 6 times a week, and there was never an outage for them. They simply adapted the company, and they shift their in studio classes to at-home studios, and the classes continued, and they've had phenomenal growth. So it's another example of where a cloud-native company just didn't have the hiccups of some other comparable companies that still run on-prem. So what impact does this have on your companies? So the reason I brought a lot of these up is that I don't think we can deny now that people are turning to cloud services. Is that whether that's companies or whether that's remote workforces that are now bypassing IT and turning to remote services to facilitate their remote work. They are turning to the cloud. There's no question. And so that raises some concerns for technology teams. The first and foremost is the reemergence of shadow IT. This is one that came up, I think the term first started being used maybe 5 years ago. And, companies addressed and tried to get a handle on of, remote workers bypassing IT and seeking out whether that's cloud services or bring your own devices, or working from home on their own computers and devices. And just bypassing IT and bypassing compliance to facilitate their work. And we've seen an exponential growth on our end for some of our customers on where this is being hit, and it has really gotten again out of hand. So as you shift these workforces remotely, COVID-19 has a huge impact on how employees are working, and so they're using their own hardware, they're downloading applications, they're using non-approved cloud services, circumventing security policies. So it raises a lot of issues on how both technology can adapt to this and work with HR to accommodate the remote workforce. Some common examples here, productivity apps, things like Trello, Slack, Asana, personal G Suite device or personal G Suite, personal Outlook.com, and then leaning on messaging services like Snapchat, WhatsApp, physical devices, so you're looking at USB drives, external drives. So a big one we've seen is cloud storage. So people bypassing corp IT and transferring intellectual property through private Dropbox, privatebox.com. And then looking at communication apps, so things like Skype and VoIP. So bypassing company telecommunications and using personal Skype, personal VoIP. This is one that I think a lot of, it's an interesting one, is that we get engaged with clients, and even some of the clients that push back the hardest and say that they have a handle on shadow IT. They have some of the rudest awakenings, is that, you pick the study out there from whoever's done a study, and it's 80+% of companies are dealing with these types of issues. It's just the nature of end users, is that they're going to seek out the path of least resistance, and if the path of least resistance is to send company data through private email to bypass corp IT policy, they're going to do it. This stat is actually, I think, would be actually higher. So in the engagements we've done, where we've actually sought out and done audits on customers around shadow IT scenarios, especially around cloud services, I would say this number is actually more like 20x. So if you look at the number of cloud services that a typical company would be using, I would say it's closer to 20 times that of unknown services that employees are using. And this is only accelerated with COVID. How people are addressing this from a company size standpoint. I don't know that we've engaged with a company where they've had a set allocated budget for things like shadow IT. It's simply usually something that's flying under the radar. It's being bundled in with something else to be addressed. And so it's not escalating past technology teams into CEOs and CFOs to really raise it as an issue. And I think COVID is one example where that's going to change. Is that a large number of our customers, this has become a forefront for them to address. How these are being addressed is the typical like 5 years ago, and how people were trying to react to this and prevent some of it, and it was a typical block or allow policy. So they were building white lists for what applications were allowed, what physical devices were allowed, and this just proved really fast that it doesn't work. It's not sustainable. It's not scalable. We've really pushed for our customers from a manage and monitor standpoint. Really get an understanding of what people are using. Rather than going in and creating a blacklist of applications people shouldn't use, they're just going to circumvent it. They're going to use a public network. They're going to attach to their cell phone to bypass company networks. They're always going to find a way around it. And so, a much better policy we found is just to manage it, monitor it, and react accordingly. You know, and a big one for us, and one of the first things we've done with customers is actually conduct an audit and openly ask employees what they're using, and not have any negative consequence there. Is just really try to understand how companies are, or how employees are trying to collaborate. You know, COVID, non-COVID. I think this is an important discussion to have, because you know, there's a lot of scenarios we've seen where IT teams have had the God complex and, you know, and blocked users from services. And the reality is, if employees have found a way to work better, you know, to open that line of communication, and maybe it's a service you consider pulling in-house. And we've done a number of these where we've worked with companies where, having gone through an audit, they see that, you know, a large percentage of the users are using a certain service, and that actually becomes a company initiative to now bring that service in-house. You know, then creating a ranking and prioritizing. Sorry, just sorry about that. So creating a system for ranking and prioritizing risk. You know, this is one we've done as well with customers, is really prioritizing, you know, a risk standpoint of applications or devices people are using, and what that means, given the use case in the company. You know, another large one, and this has become especially true with COVID as well, is BYOD policies. Is that, you know, we've worked with a number of companies that have pushed back, and they had a strict no BYOD policy for, you know, across the board, and that just wasn't, it's not feasible in COVID-19. You know, companies can't now go issue immediately 100 laptops to employees over a weekend to facilitate remote workforces. You know, so more and more employees are leaning on personal laptops, personal desktops, and cell phones. And these are all things that can be monitored, and they're all things that can be controlled through services. You know, I gave some examples here of, you know, common things we've used, like Spiderfoot, ForcePoint. You know, Palo Alto has been a big one we've used, where, you know, they can drop a device in the network or a virtual machine in a cloud instance and do a full audit, you know, passively for a few weeks, and then give a company phenomenal insight into how physical devices and applications are being used. And it's been a huge eye opener for customers. You know, both before, during, and, you know, ongoing with COVID, of how this is impacting customers' networks. So kind of leading into that, so, you know, a large topic that's come up with a lot of our customers is, you know, zero trust networking, and this is one that's been on the back burner for a lot of customers, and now being accelerated with COVID and the push to the remote workforce. So for those that don't know, for zero trust networking, is that you look at the traditional older network model of you know, protecting the perimeter, is you know, you have a, you know, inbound firewall, and then a, you know, trusted internal network where you now have full access. And this just isn't predominantly being used by modern companies today. Is that you know, the general sense is trust nobody, and you know, widely we've seen is that, you know, these companies have locked down their external networks and built these hard perimeters around their internal networks. And all it takes is one person accessing an internal machine, and they have free reign on your entire internal network. You know, whereas in a zero trust model is that, you know, we're trusting nobody. And so, you know, there's been a big push for a lot of companies as they shift to a remote workforce, and they shift to scaling their remote access. You know, turning to things beyond devices like VPNs, and looking at longer term of building in zero trust networking into their networks. You know, and especially on the adoption of more and more cloud services. You know, this protects beyond your network. You know, it's a little higher level. You know, we look at the, you know, traditional IT network of you know, 5-10 years ago, and it's a castle moat concept. You know, protect the outside. Inside you have pretty much free reign. And so, like I said, is that, you know, it only takes a breach of one device, and you know, an attacker now has access to your internal networks. And so as people turn to zero trust, It requires identification across the board for every person, every device, and it's regardless of where they sit in or outside your network. And more importantly, is there's no specific technology associated with zero trust. It's a framework for how you handle security policies going forward. So like I said, this has been a big one for customers, is that we've seen a number where they're facilitating near term on their existing remote access systems. And in parallel with that, they're immediately building a longer term plan to shift their models to zero trust, especially in the advent of the number of people that will stay remote and not be coming back to offices. A good example here is that we've turned a lot to BeyondCorp from Google. Whether you use their technologies or not, there's a framework that you can lean on that is incredibly useful to help start driving some of these discussions internally with technology teams and further up the chain, and how you would move from a traditional VPN model into a zero trust. Compliance. This is one that's been a large concern for a number of our customers. We deal with people that are dealing with SOC 2, HIPAA, have signed BAAs, and across the board is the largest portion being, again, the remote workforce, is that these directly contradict a lot of compliance controls, and so how companies are adapting to those. And as we shift these workforces remotely, we're overlooking things like privacy, security compliance, document preservation. Is that top down, HR is pushing on technology teams to facilitate these remote workforces, and they're not taking into account what compliance breaches potentially happen as they do this. So in a lot of cases, when we've had these discussions, the remote access is not actually the #1 discussion. The first discussion is what impact on compliance does shifting your remote workforce have, and address those compliance concerns prior to even shifting to a remote workforce. We look at how firms and companies are responding to the COVID-19 disruptions, and there's a large number that's addressing compliance and governance. There's HR concerns, but then you start looking into the technology, and right there with technology is how people are handling compliance and governance. Some high-level ones, again, like we could spend an entire hour discussing compliance and how it affects things like business continuity plans and controls. But high level, what we're pushing back some customers initially is, like I said, avoiding quick plans for remote access. Is that we've seen a number of companies that has immediately scaled the remote access, and in doing so, immediately breached a number of their security controls. And that's going to raise much bigger concerns down the road when they start having to go through their this year's SOC audits or HIPAA controls. There's some loosening that happened with HIPAA, but it's still widely, for some of the companies we're dealing with, not impacted. Is that but one of the identifiers we've seen as one of the largest security compliance risks is remote access. Is that people are accelerating these plans. They're it's a hasty solution where they're saying go home on a Friday and by Monday you're coming online, and they're overlooking some of these issues. On the flip side of that, though, is I would say is that this is one where talking about things like zero trust networking is that as you bake in remote access and you start looking at things like compliance, this is areas where you can start leveraging COVID-19 to modernize some of your postures and controls. If you're going to start having midterm discussions and long-term discussions, there's no reason you can't start talking about some modernization in those long-term plans. So another large one we've seen is being mindful of key person risk. We know and we've seen both personally within CardiffPoint, externally with our customers, is that, you know, one downside we've seen to remote workforce is that the single point of failures actually have a spotlight shined on them. You know, and it's definitely compounded where you have, you know, engineers and architects that become now higher risk in single points of failure. And so we've pushed heavily on some of these scenarios with customers, is that, you know, in the near term, that might make sense to start identifying some of those and considering outsourcing, or you know, even looking at internal resources where you can create redundancy in those failures. So again, you know, as we're adapting to remote work, we're ensuring employees are working from home in a compliant way. You know, again, we a lot of times in technology is that we're being forced the hand of, you know, CEOs and HR to go put these plans in place in an accelerated manner, and we're not taking into account things like business continuity plans, and considering how employees are working from home. Are they working on a personal device? Are they working on a company device? How are they accessing external services? And, you know, and more importantly is, given how they're accessing data, how does that impact things like SOC 2 controls and HIPAA and BAAs? You know, BAAs has been a big one that's come up with, you know, a lot of service providers, is, you know, internally how they're working and how their technology teams that are now working remotely, how does that impact the BAAs they've signed with their upstream providers? So it's definitely one to take into concern. You know, another one, you know, we've seen this in a number of customers, is that, you know, given the acceleration of a lot of other areas, is that security and compliance is kind of set by the wayside. And so, you know, keeping it at the forefront and maintaining a strong security and compliance culture, you know, is incredibly important. You know, and I think, you know, a big one we've pushed on is, you know, refreshing, recertifying, you know, updating training for employees. You know, if you have onboarding exercises for employees coming on around compliance training, we've actually suggested for some customers to actually repeat those, even for existing employees. You know, just to keep in mind in the forefront of, you know, compliance and security isn't just on the compliance and security teams. You know, and in some areas this falls actually on an entire organization. And like I said, providing online training, is that there's actually some decent updated training we've seen even around COVID-19 on how employees can better work remotely and stay compliant. You know, last one is revisiting compliance and business continuity plans. This is a big one as well, is that as we see people shifting technology, shifting workloads from on-premise to the cloud, there's direct impact on things like security controls and compliance controls. And so, you know, they're putting these in place and then disregarding compliance afterwards. And again, this is going to have a big impact on companies when it comes time for their yearly audits. You know, and so keeping up to date in those, and keeping up to date on BCPs and compliance controls, you know, and working in conjunction as you deploy these services has become incredibly important. Oh, sorry, double slide. Oh. So looking at next steps, you know, really laying this out, you know, today, tomorrow, next week, next month. You know, some of these might be a little bit dated for the todays and tomorrows, given we're a little bit further into the COVID than when we were going to give this talk a month and a half ago. You know, but for those that haven't started, you know, I think, you know, first and forefront is getting a handle on how teams are choosing to collaborate virtually. And when I say choosing to collaborate, that's very different than saying how companies mandating you work remotely. Because, you know, we've seen across the board is that there's the way in which companies are dictating people work remotely, and there's the reality. And the reality is typically very different than how companies are suggesting or dictating employees work. So again, doing audits on employees on what tools they're using, if they're using tools outside of IT's purview, and getting control on some of those. You ensuring things like threat risk assessments are not being ignored. Big one, identifying new remote workers is that, for companies that are increasing remote usage is making sure that IT understands who those workers are and that they are now working remote. Supply chain disruption has been a big one. It's been a big discussion with some of our customers who are still doing on-premise work. Being able to still procure hardware, procure servers and switches, firewalls. I think these are ones where, picking up the phone and talking with your vendors and understanding the impact on SLAs has been a big one. And where those SLAs can't be accommodated now, given COVID, is what's the backup plan for those? Is that cloud services? Is that degradation in service? There's a lot of impact. Looking at kind of tomorrow, first week, I think the first in the forefront is engaging workforce and implications of working remotely. How they work, what tools they work with, how they should share files, not share files, access Git repos, build software. A lot of cases these are all changing. And then securing remote access is another big one. Almost every company we've talked with has had to go out and scale whatever tool they're using or tools to facilitate remote access for employees. So doing an audit on those and understanding governance postures. Longer term, so revisiting security monitoring. This has been a big discussion with some customers. Is that baseline traffic patterns and behavior monitoring have grossly changed in the last 4 months. So where you may have predictive analytics rule sets on your firewalls, IDSs, IDPs, traffic has changed across the board, given that people are now working differently. And so a lot of alarms and monitoring people have in place for these services at the edge, they're just not current. And so rebaselining those and getting a better understanding of what the new norm for traffic looks like has been a large one with customers. And then increasing the scanning for shadow IT. We covered this one. I think this is a big topic that's come up with customers. Looking longer term, I say next month. This is reality. This is really next month through the end of the year. As COVID continues, revisiting scalability and longevity of current solutions. This is again where I discuss things like moving off of things like VPN into zero trust networks or zero trust policies. Looking at longer term scale of applications and scale of workforces. How technology teams can adapt to facilitate those. And then revisiting compliance in BCP is that, for those that haven't currently gone through their yearly audits, and that those are coming up in Q3, Q4, it's only going to get worse. And so staying ahead of those controls and staying ahead of compliance is going to be a large one. So, some big bullets. So kind of some key takeaways. Remote workforce will continue to be part of the new normal. I think this is, it's just the reality of where we're at. Companies are going to continue to turn to cloud services to scale well beyond COVID-19. I think these are the people that are going to be initial reactionary of scaling to COVID-19. And then also the companies that it's actually going to accelerate previous plans to move to the cloud that are now being accelerated. This is one across the board we've seen with our cloud native customers, is the cloud native customers will have the least impact and most adaptable to workforce and to market changes. We've seen this now with Q1 results, is that the companies that have already put these policies and processes in place are having the least impacts. The compliance and BCP discussions should stay at the forefront, and these are continued with some of our customers. So. Ran a little longer than I hoped. We do have on the line Jimmy Ruiz, who's an engineer at Google, who I was going to pass this off to. maybe run through a few slides, and hopefully we can leave some time open at the end for some Q&A.
Hi, I'm Jimmy Ruiz. I'm a customer engineer here at Google, so think of me as a technical liaison into everything Google Cloud. I cover the Western region and have been with Google for 2.5 years. So I'm not going to bore you guys too much with the slides and be respectful of your time, but I mainly wanted to give you some insights on how Google thinks of security and how to operate in this new normal, but not just to make it a new normal, but also make it a better normal, a safer normal. So here at Google, we think of security as a few key topics. One is invisible security. How do we make security invisible to the end user, but incorporate it into all of our products and all of our best practices? So we don't believe in bolting on security. We believe in building in security. So all of our products are designed with built-in security controls. We believe in making compliance automatic and building those guardrails to make sure that compliancy standards are met, to automate infrastructure, and to make sure that sensitive company data isn't leaving a customer's environment. We believe in shared fate. So moving from a shared responsibility and shared risk to everybody automatically having built-in security. And so we also believe in democratization of talent. So moving security away from specialized talent and enabling our application developers and our users to automatically apply security. So looking at the new normal, we do look at a safer normal. We do have products that can view all of your security and compliance in one dashboard. We can do things like health scans. We can do things like risk assessment and scanning your mobile applications and your web applications for areas where there could be risk involved. We believe in protecting employees. So as customers move to this shift to remote workforces, they're no longer able to access internal sites. They're not badging in. They're using mixed personal and business for browsing and email. We want to incorporate all of that into a no trust environment and be able to have employees be able to access all the apps and tools that they need with applying that security. So Rob did mention some of our products like our Beyond Corp remote access. So that's enabling our employees or customers' employees to be able to access systems exactly the same way that Google accesses. So we've got 100,000 plus employees that had to move from working in offices to moving remotely, and we didn't have to change any of our business practices. And then we want to protect our customers, because as transactions move to online and people adopting more public services, we have to be able to look at fraud, prevent bots and other malicious attacks. So we have a lot of automated services to help prevent that. So I want to leave it open for a few minutes for Q&A. So if any of you have any questions for me or for Rob, be happy to answer some of those.
So really a fascinating presentation, Rob and James. Virtual hand clap on that. You told us a lot of things that we kind of thought was going on, but you really validated it. And I see it every day. You know, we do go-to meeting, and somebody will try to get on. They say, well, our IT system won't, but I have a workaround, right? So I think that shadow IT is right on spot. And you know, this fact that, you know, we've seen IT departments come down really heavy-handed on that. And I think you're right, it's not working. And so are you seeing more of a partnership, especially with software development, where you have to, you know, documentation and data? Are you seeing any change in behavior between IT departments and development teams? Did COVID accelerate that? Was it already happening?
I think by far and large, it was already happening, but I think COVID has certainly accelerated some of that. You know, we've seen more and more is that, you know, the line between IT and engineering has definitely blurred in the last, you know, 5 years or so. You know, but the advent of things like, you know, GCP and other cloud services that's put, you know, in the hands of engineers, the ability to spin up, spin down services, is that this is pushing back on IT to have new baselines for how fast they deploy services. So I think the biggest thing with COVID is that, you know, it's raising more and more question as to how much IT departments should be running on premise versus running in the cloud. And so there's certainly been an accelerated plan to shift some of those legacy customers that are still running on-premise collaboration tools or, you know, Git repos.
We lost audio from James.
Oh, can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. We can hear you okay. Go ahead. You can keep talking. It's possible that his AirPods just died.
So I lost audio. I don't know if people could hear me.
I can still
Kevin,
hear.
can you hear me? Can you hear us?
Okay, I got it back. I'm sorry, I lost audio for a second. Sorry about that temporary delay. Yeah, I'm looking for to see if there's any other questions. I know Angelina, our chair, is of the CTO Roundtable. Angelina, do you have anything to add or any questions that you think you could ask for the team?
No, I thought that was a great overview of some of the challenges that we're all facing. You know, the fact that employees, particularly in software engineering, do what it takes to get the job done, regardless of what corporate IT policy has always been a challenge, but increasingly so when they're trying to get stuff done remotely. I'd be interested in some more details about the approach of asking people what they use and trying to bring those in-house, and if people have been successful with that without breaking the bank of kind of budget for services, because that's a challenge for certainly smaller organizations.
Sure. So I mean, I can give you an example. Recently is, you know, so one company we're working with, you know, so the typical approach here, I mean, it can be fairly informal. So I mean, this doesn't need to be an extensive process of, you know, lengthy evaluations and interviews. You know, even treating this as something like a voice of the customer exercise. These could be simple things like SurveyMonkey. I mean, like literally sending out a survey to your employees to get an understanding of the types of software services they're using. You know, one recently we looked at was, you know, a company that was, large portion of the marketing team was using Trello, which was outside the purview of IT. And from a wider standpoint, this was really just more about authentication, is that, you know, they ran Office 365 and they wanted single sign-on for Trello to put the IDPs and control of identity back on IT systems. And it was an inexpensive solution. You know, Trello is not an expensive service, but it, you know, brought it back within the company and then expanded beyond marketing into other teams to start using Trello boards and linking that into Jira to start better tracking cross-team communication. You know, a broader one we've seen is that, you know, we've worked with Palo Alto like I said, dropping in a physical or a virtual appliance into networks and letting that passively run for a few weeks or a month, to give an IT a better understanding of applications where maybe they don't think the employees will be honest about what applications they're running, or may think there's going to be repercussions still, even if there's upfront there won't be repercussions. But devices like Palo Alto will give you a clear view of what is and isn't being used. We did one about a month ago where, I think it was 95% of their traffic in any given day was YouTube Music. And they didn't know, like they didn't realize that, that large of a portion was being used.
I just think, Rob, I think flexibility on that in the past has been, it's a complete culture change. If you send out a survey to a company, say I'm not going to do it because then you're going to shut me down. And so I think that communication and that culture change, which is what I was getting to at my first question, I was really fascinated by your approach to it, which is try to co-opt that in instead of saying, no, we're cutting everything or we're cutting YouTube Music off. No, we just want to understand so we can mitigate any security, implications for that. It was, I just think you need to change a culture too of how honest people are.
Yeah, and that has been the general approach is when the surveys have gone out that we've done. It's not been about we want to know what traffic's being used to turn it off. It was a very upfront, collaboration with employees to let them know is that we want to understand what tools you're using, so that we can go purchase these and use them as a company.
Okay, I think we're coming to the end unless anyone, again, so I want to do one more thing. So tell us a little bit, this is great, but if somebody was a small company and they want to engage Cardiff, do you do will you put a whole system process? What's your kind of sweet spot about what you guys do for companies yourself? What does CardiffPoint do specifically?
So we have a broad range of talent within the company. I think taking companies down that path of the cloud native journey, so companies that may be still sitting a portion on premise or hybrid, and bringing them to a more cloud native position. So any aspect of that journey, whether that's technology, whether that's compliance, training, we've done this at very large scale for previous companies. So we've got, myself, I've scaled, services through 100 million plus users multiple times. We've got TAMs that came from Amazon for 5 or 6 years. So we've really seen a breadth of companies and dealt with taking companies through that path.
So let me be more
really
specific. Since this is going to be on YouTube itself, and I don't see an email at the end, tell us about how someone specifically would engage Cardiff. Give us an email of someone, whether that's you. I know I talked to the Cameron. So give us an email. So if someone's watching this at a later point and they want to engage Cardiff, they know where to go.
Sure. So myself is Rob at CardiffPoint. It's pretty easy. Cameron is our CRO. I think he's on the line. It's just Cameron at CardiffPoint.com. And happy to have these discussions with customers, and purely even if it's exploratory. I'd love to hear some of the challenges also that maybe people are having around COVID that maybe didn't fall into the presentation that they're dealing with. These are kind of uncertain times, and we talk about new norms, but I think the reality is new norms are going to become permanent norms, and so hearing more of those would be interesting.
Yeah, and I don't want to speak for the CTO, Chief Software Development Roundtable, because Angelina's on, but Angelina, maybe an opportunity to even bring some of these folks back to speak to the group at a later time.
Yeah, I think that would be interesting. I think a lot of smaller companies combine heads of software engineering with heads of IT. So I think there's probably some good overlap there.
Okay, so we're going to wrap it up again. A big virtual handshake to our presenters, Rob, and then our engineer from Google. Thank you very much. I'm not going to say it's much better as expected, but this covered everything we had hoped we would cover. So very good job. We will archive this, and we will have this available on YouTube in a few days. Sarah, anything else before we sign off?
In case any of you are looking for some guidance on the COVID-19 issues, challenges that you're facing at work, feel free to go to techsandiego.org, click on events, and register for August 27th COVID-19 stand-up meeting. That will be from 8 a.m. to 8:30, and it will be just a quick brainstorming session addressing any issues that may have arisen specifically to operating during the pandemic.
And that's an ongoing meeting. So if you miss it, those of you who might be watching this on YouTube, missing this month, just go to our website and you'll be able to see it. And there's all other resources on work-related issues with COVID. Let's go and end this session. Thanks to everyone. Thanks to Cardiff. Thanks to Sarah, our events marketing manager. And again, visit techsd.org. You can listen to our podcast wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Just search for Tech San Diego. We have TSD Spotlight, and then we have our talent related podcast. So thank you very much, and we'll go ahead and end it now. And Sarah, you could do that because I don't know how.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, thanks.